All right. Thank you once again for inviting me. And now we're going to talk about respiratory oscillometry, an alternative method to assess airway caliber. And what I'm going to do is explain a little bit about the underlying physiology behind respiratory oscillometry, pardon the typo, and the review of the ERS technical standards, and then I will also share with you one easy case that I have. Well, when we think of that maximum flow volume loop or maximum flow volume envelope, and once again, give credit to my mentor, Dr. Robert Hyatt, in his description of this, there are many mechanical and physiologic things that need to take place. So when we take that deep breath in, there is inspiratory resistance of the airways. It requires muscle force in order to take a deep breath in. And as I mentioned, in the individuals with neuromuscular disease, their reduction in their vital capacity is because of that weakness of their inspiratory muscles. All of these things take effort. Once we reach TLC, or the largest breath that we can inhale, there are static mechanics that are in play, and respiratory muscle force, of course. And then when we blast our air out, not only does it require muscle force and effort, but there are stress relaxation processes that take place. There is also upper airway limitation and airflow limitation as they exhale their air out. By the way, here it is. I think that will. Now I got it functioning. Okay. And then we, of course, then go all the way down to residual volume, which requires a lot of muscle force and effort. So, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about respiratory oscillation, formerly known as force oscillatory technique. Once again, I apologize for the error in spelling, and or FOT. We are now describing it simply as respiratory oscillometry because it does not require any forced effort by the individual. All they do is breathe tidally through the instrument, and the instrument itself creates the dynamic responses that we're looking for. So when we look at respiratory oscillometry, it requires an understanding of the basic kinetics that take place in the lungs. And whenever we are using a mass, whether that mass be a solid, a liquid, or a gas, it requires the application of force, but there is also other things in play. There are restrictive properties or resistive properties. There are rebound or spring properties that then create an opposite force or reaction. So we look at Newton's law, the third law of motion, and that law states that for every action there's an equal or opposite reaction. And that opposition to flow, in this case, includes elastance, resistance, and inertance. All three of these are part of the opposition of flow. So if we think about a single component model, if you look at the measurement of pressure, flow, and volume that's generated during the mouth during breathing, one can then solve for resistance, elastance, and inertia that is causing a resistance or impedance to the flow going in and out of the lung. So as flow alternates between inflow and out of flow of the lung, in this single compartment model, and obviously the lungs have millions of compartment models, so this is a small characterization of that. It requires additional pressure to accelerate and decelerate a mass of gas, and that is known as inertance. So the resistance to flow, which is created by pressure, is both the resistance, the inertance, and elastic properties of the lung, and that is the equation of motion. So impedance of the respiratory system, and if you recognize the general formula here, we have change in pressure over change of flow. That change of pressure actually is just not resistance, but it's elastance and inertance also at the same time. In a body plethysmograph, when we're looking at specific airways resistance or airways resistance, we're discounting the impact of elastance and inertance. And so the equation of change in pressure over change in flow is how we would describe resistance in a body plethysmograph. So impedance itself, and or known as Z, it can be conceived as a generalization of resistance, since it embodies both the in-phase and out-of-phase relationships between this pressure and flow. The in-phase component is called the real part of impedance and or resistance, if you want to take those other components out of it. And the out-of-phase relationship is expressed as the imaginary part and or the reactance. So we have on the y-axis flow and on the x-axis pressure, and we have the real part of the resistance, and we have the imaginary part of the resistance. If we oscillate flow, the total opposition to flow and or the net sum of forces that must be overcome is termed the impedance. And once again, the impedance is determined by not only resistance, elastance, and inertia, but also the frequency of the oscillation. And so the oscillometers typically will have multiple different frequencies that we can apply to the airway, and those differences of frequencies will then produce different types of characteristics. And much of this related to the frequency is related to time-varying mechanical properties, which we also call viscoelastance. So if we look at the data that comes from an oscillometer, we have impedance represented, or the sum, and then we have resistance and reactance that is frequency dependent. So depending on the frequency that the oscillometer is going to use, it may describe what's happening in the peripheral airways, or it may describe what is happening in the central airways. So my colleague David Kaminsky did a review article looking at the clinical significance and applications of respiratory oscillometry. I would highly recommend it as something that you read and look up. Published in ER Review in 2022. And here he then looks at or describes some of these very basic principles, such as the resistance of the respiratory system at 5 hertz and 20 hertz. What is the reactance curve look like? And what does that reactance curve look like in various areas? And then the area of the reactance, which is the area underneath the curve between 0 and the responsiveness of the reactance. And depending on what that parameter does, you can look at various characteristics. So in a healthy individual, the airway's resistance, or the resistance measured by oscillometry, is fairly stable throughout the system, depending on the frequency, remembering that lower frequencies will penetrate deeper and thus be representative of what's happening in the peripheral airways. Higher frequencies will be more representative of what's happening in the central airways. And if you have no difference in between those values, then that is what you typically see. R20 versus R5 is not significantly different. Same with reactance, it's not different. The other point that I didn't make on the last cartoon was resonant frequency, and that's where it crosses the 0 line. In an individual with COPD, of course, resistance is going to be higher. We know this because of floppy airways, or in individuals that have chronic bronchitis and the airways are blocked with mucus. Resistance is going to be higher across the board, but it's also going to be higher in the peripheral airways versus the central airways. Reactance itself is also going to shift. Some individuals think of reactance as like compliance of the lung, right? So the reactance is going to shift also, and so that area under the reactance is going to be larger than the area under the reactance that we would see in someone with normal healthy lung. This cartoon from the Ganshorn website clearly describes the 3 different patterns that you might see. So the reactance at 5 hertz is going to be, in a normal individual, it's going to be normal, and the reactance at 20 hertz is going to be normal. So we see this pattern throughout the curve itself as being very stable. And the area under the reactance curve, this little portion right here, is going to be within the normal limits also. In someone that has central obstruction, the resistance at R5 and R20 are going to be the same, but they're going to be elevated. And the reactance or area of the curve is going to be normal. But in someone with COPD, their, in particular, peripheral obstruction, their R5 is going to be elevated. Their R20 is going to be elevated, but their R5 to R20 relationship is going to be higher, and the area under the curve is going to be higher also. So a technical standard was published by the European Respiratory Society in 2020 on how to perform this test, and we'll talk about what they included in this technical standard. And I might add that even though this is a technical standard, an official document of the European Respiratory Society, many members, Charlie Irvin, David Kaminsky, and others that served on the working group were representing the American Thoracic Society. So even though published as an ERS technical standard, it really had representatives from both of the professional groups. Now, when we look at the history of oscillometry, it goes way back. So this is my mentor, Dr. Hyatt, when he was a younger man back in 1956, using a 12-inch speaker to create the oscillometry waveforms, or the air waveforms. So here we have a loudspeaker, a 12-inch speaker connected to a chymograph, or a water-sealed spirometer connected to a recorder, an analog recorder, to get the values of R5, R20, and other values related to oscillating airway flow through the airways versus someone having to take a deep breath and blast the air out to characterize the airways themselves. Modern day technology is certainly much better than that. We have impulse oscillometers, which use a speaker. We have airwave oscillometry, which uses a membrane to create the airwave oscillometries that take place. Some require the interface to an instrument and a computer, and others require an interface like the one that we have in the conference room here that are very small in nature and require a connection to an iPad or something else, but certainly very portable in allowing to use oscillometry in a clinical manner and have less complications associated with it, and certainly what Dr. Hyatt was using back in 1956. So what did they use for setting up the instrument? First of all, the instrument does need to have calibration verification, and we verify the resistance by using a known resistive element in place, and all of the various instruments have a verification of resistance algorithm when you're performing the test, and they have a maximum expected error rate of 10%. As far as the subject themselves, you perform the test in a seated position. Unlike a body box, you don't need to be within a cabinet, but you essentially just need to have the instrument. You hold your head in a neutral position. You do need to have cheek support because the oscillometry device is creating waveforms, and we don't want to have the cheeks be impacted by that. In the technical standard, they have minimal instructions that need to be given to the subject themselves. Those minimal instructions include not only how to put the mouthpiece in correctly, of course, biting down on the mouthpiece gently, just like in spirometry, making sure the mouthpiece is on the top of the tongue versus the tongue having an influence, making sure that they have a nose clip and a tight seal. But in the description, describing to the individual that they will feel a gentle vibration or fluttering as they're breathing quietly. So when I would test young individuals in particular, I would tell them that it would be like, and they would feel very gentle pulsations within the instrument itself that is creating these airwaves technology. They do need to breathe on the mouthpiece for about 20 to 30 seconds. So in testing a young individual, sometimes it's nice to have a distractor. You do not want to have a distractor that makes them laugh or giggle or respond to the distractor, but sometimes it's kind of nice to have that to take their attention off of just breathing quietly while they're getting that type of a signal put on their airways itself. You need to collect data for about 3 minutes, and the data collection part of it needs to be about 20 to 30 seconds long. And as far as acceptability of the data itself that you're analyzing, you want to make sure that they're not swallowing, that they don't have glottic closure, that they don't have a leak around the mouthpiece, that they don't have irregular breathing. It's nice if it's just very quiet, stable breathing. But the important part of this is that we can characterize the airway with just quiet breathing. So in an individual that cannot take a deep breath and forcefully blow it out and do that successfully as we require from them in spirometry, with oscillometry, all they have to do is breathe quietly. So in individuals that are very, very young and individuals that are very old and or individuals with neuromuscular disease, oscillometry is a wonderful method of being able to understand the dynamics of airway function without having to do a deep breath and exhale it forcefully. So we want to get at least 3 technically acceptable measurements, and the subject can come off the mouthpiece after each one of these, and we'd like to have repeatability or coefficient of variation less than 10% in adults and 15% in children. If we look at that article that was published by David Kaminsky and colleagues, he goes through the various scenarios of where oscillometry may have an application. And I'm not going to be able to go through all those various applications, clinical applications or uses, but I did want to point out 2 in particular. One is bronchoresponsive testing, where oscillometry appears to have robust differences related to devices and populations. Bronchial challenge testing, where oscillometry can also be used as an alternative method to spirometry, and what that change may be. Now, since David's paper, there have been some other information that have been published that I'll share with you, but he also listed a long host of clinical applications for this device. And essentially, as a clinician, if you want to understand or characterize airway function in someone that is challenged by performing routine spirometry, oscillometry is a wonderful alternative. As far as reference populations, there needs to be more work done. In this paper that was published in 2022 in the European Respiratory Review, they looked at oscillometry and the differences amongst populations. They did it systematically. They noted that there's a relatively high variability, which is why the responses have to be larger. So in spirometry, we look at a 10% response or change in bronchodilator. It's much larger in oscillometry because of the added within subject variability of the test itself. But essentially, they also called out for the scientific community for the need for a broader interpopulation demographic review, and GLI is currently collecting data related to oscillometry and what is normal or abnormal. So there continues to be improvement in our scientific knowledge of not only the uses, but what we call abnormal or normal, and what we call a minimal clinically significant difference. And in this paper that was published also in 2023, and you can see that a lot of this information is relatively new, because even though oscillometry has been around since the 50s, it's really only in the last decade where we've seen an increase in its use. And part of that is the portability of the units and the reduction in the pricing of the units so that it's available to more individuals. But they looked at minimally clinically important differences and cut point values related to a decline in resistance and area of reactance. Also, in the technical standard that I alluded to earlier, they defined a positive response to bronchodilators as a decrease in R5 of 40% or an increase in reactance of 50%. So once again, a larger change than what we would expect in spirometry measurements of FEV1, but we are starting to understand what is a clinically significant change and how we characterize that. In a recent paper that was also published in 2022, they looked at that there maybe should be a difference in between children responses and adult responses, and the adult responses have less variability, so they're suggesting that a change be less than children in adults. But I think in general, if we just take that 40% and 50% as reminders of what we expect to see as a change, we will not over-interpret the responses, and we'll make sure that the responses are clinically significant. If we look at the literature and what we see as values of response, once again, my colleague and mentor, Dr. Hyatt, back in 1987, recognized that in doing methacholine challenges, that this was an element that you could use to characterize that, and in particular in children. So he looked at 12 normal subjects and looked at their response to FEV1 and to the bronchodilator response, and he also was an early contributor to the literature on what the deep breath means to someone that's doing a methacholine challenge. So we recognized in the new 2017 standard related to methacholine challenge in particular, that if you take a deep breath of the mechanism, that itself can add to the reduction in the response. And so Dr. Hyatt, way back in 1987, recognized that this was impactful. Here's another paper that was published in 313 children. 132 of them, more than a third of them, could not perform spirometry, but they were able to perform oscillometry very easily. Here's another paper that was published looking at 49 school children and whether or not they had chronic lung disease and comparing their response to FEV1 and to either resistance or reactance. And those individuals that may have an abnormal reactance versus a normal spirometry test itself. You don't think I have a big enough voice? And in this paper that was published in Respiratory Medicine in 2012, looking at the response to a methacholine challenge and the response that would be required from an FEV1 perspective and the response that would be required from a resistance perspective. So making the comparisons in individuals that could perform spirometry. This is data that we did within my laboratory, and so we looked at quiet breathing and the response to methacholine. And if you look at, the positivity of a test and or being negative, you end up with a group of individuals that were negative to FEV1 in their methacholine response, but positive in their reactance response. So is this cohort of individuals those that are affected by the deep breath maneuver that you still have to perform in order to do spirometry versus normal quiet breathing that you have when you're doing an oscillometry measurement itself? So if we look at a given clinical case, and I'm not suggesting that oscillometry is limited to young individuals. I'm not suggesting that it's limited to individuals that have neuromuscular disease or the elderly, but certainly it's a methodology that lends itself to performing it on children, because sometimes children have difficulty in performing a acceptable and repeatable spirometry measurement. So in this particular case, we had a 4-year-old male who their mother reported that they coughed every night, and it was worse in the winter and with exercise. So certainly the subjective evidence was there that they might have hyperreactive airways disease. In their evaluation, they did a chest x-ray, they did allergy testing, they had the individual scheduled for lung function tests and spirometry. The chest x-ray, of course, came back all negative related to this, and their skin testing for allergies were negative. But they couldn't perform spirometry. And so we had an oscillometer in our laboratory, so we were able to do oscillometry rather than spirometry, and showed a 30% increase or reduction in their R5 value for oscillometry. And because of those results, they were able to give that individual, based on objective evidence, a asthma action plan, which included the use of albuterol and other medication. If you look at Dr. Kaminsky's paper, as far as the gaps in knowledge and the future needs for defining clinical applications for oscillometry, certainly harmonization of the devices itself and settling in on particular the parameters. Just like in spirometry, you can have a plethora of divisions of mathematical computations related to how we blow the air out, but we focus in on forced vital capacity and FEV1 and the ratio as the primary values required to interpret a spirometry value. In oscillometry, we have multiple frequencies that the manufacturers can use, but essentially we are settling in on reactance and resistance parameters measured at frequencies at 5 and 20 instead of 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, or all the other derivatives that can be done. But there needs to be harmonization across all manufacturers on how that is done. We know that we need to have better and more robust reference equations. We're getting closer to that, and as I mentioned, GLI is currently collecting data on that. We need to understand or know about the variability and reliability of the instruments. We need to understand what a minimally clinically important change is. We have limited information at this time based on what I showed you was published in the European Respiratory Review, but we need to strengthen that knowledge as far as what is a clinically important change in the data itself. And then whether it be bronchoprovocation and or bronchodilation response, we need to have cut points that we are certain of. I think we are definitely closer to that than we've ever been before, and looking at responses of 40% in resistance and 50% in reactance as far as a response, including the variability of the measurement and the other influencers that may impact that response. And so I am going to stop at this point. Not only do I cover this subject in my textbook, but we also have a book chapter in a pediatric book that is very well respected that covers oscillometry also. So I appreciate your time. It's a challenging subject. More importantly, it's incredibly easy to use as long as we understand it. And if we don't understand reactance, If we don't understand area under the curve of reactance or the resonance frequency, we all should understand resistance and what resistance means. And this is a very simple way, without a body plethysmograph, of being able to measure resistance in a subject that cannot perform spirometry. So thank you very much.
I have one question.
Yes.
It's from Professor Lakmali from Colombo University.
Yes.
She is asking to the prior presentation, do you need to have a country-specific reference value to use lower limit of normal?
Boy, so he's asking a question that was brought up related to reference populations or reference sets that we addressed in our initial presentation. The person asking the question, do you have to have a country-specific normal? In the best of worlds, a country-specific or an ethnic-specific equation would be the best, right? But the problem is collecting that data and making sure that it's done correctly in order to collect that information. I think you could tell from my lecture that I'm fairly, in my opinion, honed in on using specific population equations rather than a global equation. If someone can self-identify as being of that ethnicity and or ancestral background and or country specific. But obviously country specific means nothing in a country that is very heterogeneous, like USA or European populations, right? Because we have people from all over the world coming and having marriages within different ethnic or ancestral backgrounds. Country specific, in my opinion, is more ethnicity specific, such as individuals who are born and raised and come from Southeast Asia, from Vietnam or Thailand or wherever it may be. And in those particular instances, having country-specific equations can be beneficial.
Okay, thank you very much.
You bet.
Thank you.
Professor Kern.
Yes.
In the slide of the MCID, there is an abbreviation of FDR. What does it mean? FDR.
Functional or forced diagnostic response, I believe. I would have to go back to the paper to actually pull that out. Sorry. Leave it up to Professor Land to ask a hard question. No. You're going to summarize, Dr.
Yes.
Kwan? Okay. All right.
Sau đây thì mình xin tóm tắt lại một số cái điểm mà giáo sư Mottram có nói. Thì trong cái phần này thì giáo sư nói về cái dao động, gọi là cái dao động hô hấp. Mình dịch hiện giờ, hồi trước mình hay là dao động xung ký, nhưng hiện giờ thì mình gọi là dao động hô hấp. Thì cái dao động hô hấp này thì đầu tiên đó thì mình nói về thứ nhất đó là cái nguyên tắc để mà mình đo một cái dao động hô hấp. Thì về cái nguyên tắc đo thì nó cũng hiểu một cách đơn giản đó, thì nó sẽ là khi mà chúng ta đo cái máy thì cái máy nó sẽ phát ra những cái sóng. Thì lúc đầu mình thấy những cái hình máy nó sẽ phát ra những cái sóng, và những cái sóng đó nó sẽ được cái hệ hô hấp của mình, khi mình hít thở và hít vô thở ra như vậy, nó sẽ được hấp thu và nó được phản xạ, phản hồi lại. Thì khi mà mình đo cái hấp thu và đo cái phản hồi đó thì mình sẽ biết được là cái hệ hô hấp của mình nó có bất thường gì hay không. Và cái mình sẽ có cái reactant và cái resistant. Reactant là cái xuất đàn, resistant là cái kháng trở của đường dẫn khí, của đường thở của mình. Thì cái sự phản hồi và hấp thu của những cái đại lượng như R, 5, R hoặc là X đó thì nó phụ thuộc vào cái tần số, của cái sóng. Và hai cái chỉ số mà mình thường hay làm nhất đó là cái R5, X5 và R20, X20. Đó là những cái chỉ số mà tại đó thì mình có thể phát hiện ra được, mình có thể thấy được cái sự khác biệt giữa những cái bất thường của cái hệ hô hấp của mình dựa trên cái dao động hô hấp. Thì tiếp theo thì mình nói về cái câu chuyện nữa, đó là giáo sư nói về những cái phần mà liên quan tới cái việc mà chúng ta sẽ định chuẩn cái máy như thế nào, những cái thao tác mình thực hiện cái máy. Thì về cái thao tác thực hiện máy thì mình thấy là mình đo thì mình sẽ cho người khi đo cái này nó đo rất là đơn giản. Người ta chỉ cần đo, người ta ngậm vào, người ta thở một cách bình thường, mình lấy hai cái tay giữ cái máy lại để mà tránh cái máy phình và phình, nó làm kết quả nó bị sai khi đo. Và khi bệnh nhân cái người đo thì cần thở bình thường khoảng 3 phút, và cái thời gian thở mà lấy mẫu thì khoảng tầm 30 giây. Mình có thể lấy được cái mẫu, và sau đó thì mình sẽ có những cái tiêu chuẩn mà chúng ta xem trong slide, những tiêu chuẩn khi nào là lặp lại được, những cái tiêu chuẩn khi nào hướng dẫn cho cái người đo như thế nào thì chúng ta có thể xem thêm. Và về cái việc mà phân tích những cái kết quả này thì mình sẽ thấy rằng giáo sư thì có một slide lấy từ cái của Ganshorn đó, thì mình sẽ thấy rằng cái việc mà phân tích thì nó dựa trên cái đó là mình dựa trên hai cái chỉ số chính, đó là cái R5, R20, X5 và X20. Thì mình sẽ thấy rằng nếu mà cả ba cái chỉ số này mà bốn cái chỉ số này nó bình thường thì xem như là nó bình thường. Còn nếu mà trong cái trường hợp mà nó tăng ở cái R5 thì mình sẽ thấy rằng đó, thì cái đây có thể là cái tắc nghẽn đường nhân khí trung tâm. Tại vì cái sóng á, mình thấy là cái sóng mà cái tần số lớn á, thì mình sẽ thấy cái xu hướng của nó thì nó sẽ được truyền, cái khả năng mà nó xuyên thấu nó kém hơn, nó sẽ truyền kém hơn. Còn nếu mà trong cái trường hợp mà cái R mà nó tăng ở cả cái R5, R20 thì có thể là tắc nghẽn đường dẫn khí xa, và có thể là cả đường dẫn khí trung tâm nữa. Thì đó là cái mà mình có thể lý giải được cái kết quả. Còn cái giá trị tham khảo thì nó rất là phụ thuộc, vì nó có nhiều cái nghiên cứu và do có nhiều cái hãng máy khác nhau, cho nên là cái giá trị tham khảo thì nó sẽ hơi phụ thuộc vào cái hãng mà mình sử dụng. Và ngoài ra có một cái điểm mà ưu điểm của cái iOS này là mình có thể sử dụng để mà mình xem coi cái test giãn phế quản nó có đáp ứng hay không. Thì hiện giờ thì guideline cũng tương đối là có những cái guideline để mà mình hướng dẫn cái việc mà mình sử dụng cái R5 và X5 để mà mình xem cái đáp ứng với test giãn phế quản. Nhưng mà nó sẽ khác nhau giữa người lớn và trẻ em. Thì đối với trẻ em thì mình sẽ thấy rằng cái quan trọng là cái tiêu chuẩn mới thì trẻ em thì R5 thì nó sẽ là giảm 40%, và X5 sẽ là tăng 50%. Còn đối với người lớn thì cái R5 sẽ giảm 32% và X5 sẽ tăng là 44%. Đó là cái phần mà mình khi mà chúng ta phân tích cái kết quả thì mình có thể mình xem, và mình dựa trên cái kết quả mà mình xem coi là một cái iOS nó có đáp ứng với test giãn phế quản hay không, hoặc là có những cái tăng cái kháng trở của đường dẫn khí của mình khi mà chúng ta đo cho cái người mà đo, cũng như là mình phân tích cái kết quả đo một cái dao động hô hấp. Thì đó là cái phần bài của giáo sư Cạc. Okay.
I was also going to mention for those of you that are here at the conference that our representative from Ganshorn, our sponsor, brought a oscillometry device, and if you would like to have a test on yourself, you can test yourself to see what it feels like and what your results look like also. So it's kind of a very interesting technology, and it doesn't require that you take a deep breath and blast your air out. It just requires that you breathe quietly. But it's kind of interesting to see how it feels if you're going to actually have one or order it for your patient. So they do have it available, and you can talk to Lars, and he will do a test on you. So this afternoon, yes, yes. Later today.
Thì bây giờ mình sẽ cái phần mà thực hành máy thì cái bên Ganshorn có mang theo cái máy, thì nếu mà mình làm thì mình sẽ để đến chiều nay thì mình sẽ có 2 tiếng, đúng không? 2 tiếng đồng hồ là mình thực tập nhiều máy lắm, bao gồm cả máy đo cái dao động hô hấp và đo những cái khác nữa, thì mình sẽ có thời gian mình đo. Sáng nay thì mình chủ yếu là học những cái phần lý thuyết và những cái phần mà phân tích. Buổi chiều này mình nên có thời gian mình thực tập, mình xem coi nó như thế nào, thì nó sẽ rất là hay. Thì cái này chỉ dành cho cái đại biểu nào mà tham dự offline thôi. Tại vì online thì chắc chỉ nhìn thôi chứ không có được đo.